And I guess he's recording. Also, he's recording. Okay, we'll get started. My name's Steve Randall, and this is a presentation on the so-called zone. Sometimes people talk about the zone in sports. So this is supposed to be kind of a mental state that people can get into, that we can get into. But it seems like not many people know much about it. And when athletes talk about it, it sounds like they don't know what they're talking about either, except that they sometimes get into it mostly by accident or by virtue of having done a lot of practice in their sport. So maybe we can learn a little bit more about it, because it really seems to hold quite a bit of promise as far as our performance and our sense of well-being. After Tarthan-Tuku wrote the first 3 or 4 books on time, space, and knowledge, on the time, space, and knowledge vision, or what we sometimes call the TSK vision, it was about 1990 or a little bit later, and Jack Petranker, who was the primary editor for the TSK books at that point, Jack Petranker gave me a call and he said, Rinpoche gave me this project and I'm swamped. He wants us to go through all the books that we have on TSK. And as I recall, there were 3 or 4 at that point. And to find all the descriptions and definitions of time and space and knowledge. And he said, I thought about you. Because he didn't have time to do it. So I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And so I spent some weeks going through all the books and trying to identify important descriptions or definitions of time, space, and knowledge in all the books. And that led to this project on the zone and quite a few other things actually since then. So this is about time, space, and knowledge, which is a vision of reality, and which Rinpoche then called a new vision of reality. So that was pretty evocative. All right, let's take a look at the objectives for this talk. Where's my arrows? Here we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about what a vision of peak performance is and why it might be useful. And second, we'll try to identify essential qualities of our peak experiences. We've probably all had some. We've probably all had many. But it's pretty doubtful that we've thought about them very much based on my past experiences in workshops. And then third, we're going to compare those essential qualities to our typical way of being in the world and doing things. What am I? No. The comparison, you want this one? No.
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Only for. Thank you.
Yeah. So the comparison part is very important. There is a typical way that we exist in the world and do things. And that's another thing that we don't really think about very much. So, a couple of definitions. What is the zone? A simple definition is that second bullet down, a state of mind in which one's performance seems supernormal or very exceptional. So it's a state of mind. And you might say it's the best state of mind. But we have to figure out what it means to say the best. And how is the phrase peak experience used? This was first used mostly by Maslow. It's a high point in our life, you could say that. These are definitions from online references. Okay. So we could say that putting these two together, the zone is a state of mind during a peak experience. It's good enough for starters. Why should we study the zone? Well, it represents the best way mentally to do anything. Of course, we're making some assumptions that there might even be a best way, but we can do that to get started. If we know this, if we know some characteristics of the zone and some characteristics of our normal experience, our so-called normal Western experience, which we learn when we grow up here in the West, then we know where we're going and where we are now, and perhaps we can go from one to the other. There might be different vehicles for making that trip. That's another question. But TSK is a vehicle for making trips like this. And it seems to work pretty well too. I think another thing that we can say is that TSK is a comprehensive vision of reality. Comprehensive in the sense that it'll take you from almost any point in our inner reality to almost any other point, at least eventually. Yeah.
Could you go back to the reference of TSK or defining it? I use those initials a lot, but I don't remember.
Oh, I didn't find it anywhere here.
Yeah, I know.
But here, it's time, space, and knowledge. That's it. It's just TSK. It's just a slang way we refer to it. And right now there's about 6 books that Rinpoche has written in the Time, Space, and Knowledge series, all the way back from first one in 1977. Thanks for asking. I wanted to work this in anyway. Second one was written in 1987. The third one, 1990. And then there were 3 more after that.
Why was he so concentrated, or is on that over a period of time?
Well, he said that actually the entire vision was in the first book, in the sense that everything that you needed to know that was available in the vision was accessible by means of the first book. But I guess he just still felt like writing 5 more books.
You say in the vision.
Yeah, the vision is not a book, okay? The book is a vehicle, you could say. It's a means of getting where the vision will take you. the transformation that the vision will make for a person.
The vision being,
That's what we're going to talk about. Yeah. And I think in a sense you could say it's here, but it's not locatable. In the same sense that awareness is not locatable. But your awareness is here. I think it's another thing we don't often talk about. Good enough?
I think so.
Good, thanks. Those are good questions. All right. Can we generally describe the zone? Well, this is the same order of thing that you just asked about. The best things in life aren't things, and we can't point to them. So they're difficult to understand, and they're difficult to apprehend. They're difficult to embody. There's all kinds of things we can say about them. Impossible to point to. And they're, as I said, they're difficult to understand. But they're probably also the most important things in life. And for that reason, quite often we leave them for last.
And what are they?
Well, I named several of them. You know, awareness, happiness, another one. People quite often talk about happiness these days, or at least in some circles, but it's not well understood. People disagree about what happiness is and the depth of it, and the possibilities of it. Okay, so even though we might not be able to define this in terms of specific things or processes or even best practices as they sometimes discuss in business, we might be able to describe it in terms of how we do things or our perspective or our mental state. There's different words we can use here too, and I think it's difficult to pin down to any one word like quality, because what I'm trying to describe mostly goes beyond qualities, especially the way we usually use the word. But perhaps perspective is a little better word. We'll have some quotes from the TSK books, and then you can maybe get a better idea for what I'm trying to get at. Okay, I'll go on. All right, at this point, I'm going to take several minutes, give you a chance to recall some peak experiences that you had in your life, and try to see if you can understand what was important about them, what specific qualities or feeling tones or what resources you were using, something like that. Do you have an idea for what I'm talking about? See if you can recall some experiences you've had that were, for some reason, very special for you. Or you might say they were super. And the question is, why? We're not questioning that they were super, but we're questioning why they were super. Okay? So take a couple of minutes and just recall, if you can, some very peak type experiences that you've had. And I'll be quiet so you can get into it a little bit. Okay, now if you would, get together with one other person and share what you've come up with. We'll take a couple of minutes for that. A couple of minutes for each person to maybe tell the other one what you came up with. We probably need to have one group of three.
And you? You have, I couldn't think of any sequence fitness. Oh my goodness.
It's funny when our mind is also I was learning continuing education. So now I know it sounds great. I understand. I make art. I feel like it sounds great. Pretty much sort of awareness rather than something. I don't feel like my focus is that great. It's just if I'm pushing it and going back and starting to like maybe
I see. I don't want to eat it.
Yeah.
working a little bit with the seed brush. The gouache. Watercolor. Control.
Yeah. Sounds awesome. 6-month retreats. So you've been doing
Sort of a different way of thinking. Relaxing.
Oh, what are some of the other good chocolate?
So you're using babies.
It's on your whole side.
Yes, that's
experiences in the area of
Also, I know. I see some. What's going on?
any experiential life, on a level higher than normal.
Oh my goodness. Let me know stuff like
Okay, is that enough time?
Yeah, it's incredible. Oh my goodness. I don't have the experience like that. Oh my goodness.
Okay, if you had to describe those
That's amazing.
qualities or whatever you want to call them in like a couple of words, what would you use?
The same.
That's
I probably would say.
kind of rude.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just thinking, because
Try to filter it down into that, but what would you use for a couple of words to describe those qualities? Yeah.
For me, I think it's beyond awareness of body-mind, so it's kind of a transcendent, maybe blissful, ecstatic experience that is beyond what I would generally experience. And those are the times that I can recall that were that way.
Okay. Good. How about you? Just a few words.
Focus, hyper focus,
Uh-huh.
kind of zone, I guess.
Strong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hyper focus. Okay.
Hello. So I was just sharing with her that the thing that stood out to me the most was, when I was younger,
Yeah.
I had like a 6-month period where I was dying, literally.
Wow.
And, but they didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But I would just fall out. And, that was it. And what I realized is that during that time of being flat on my back, I was at home, but,
Did you faint or what?
Huh?
Did you faint?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And what I got was that my body was taking me out of a situation I didn't know what to be in, but I didn't know how to get out of it because I still had to work. And I found out unemployment exists. But what I realized is that, because literally they didn't know whether I was going to make it, and I didn't either. And what I realized is that the awareness would continue anyway. And it wasn't some like wish that I had. It was like this knowing.
Yeah.
And so I got to sit for 6 months
Wow.
while I was kind of letting that flow through.
So an awareness that didn't go away.
Whether I was in a body or not. No, I mean, seriously, it was really quite clear.
Yeah.
And surprising. It wasn't a wish that I had or something.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, you didn't control it.
And it was about the same time that the Tibetans also, about 5 years later, the Tibetans.
You got overrun?
Yeah, but that meant they were here.
Uh-huh.
So good, bad,
Okay.
go together.
Yeah. You?
Not much.
Not much. Okay.
Sort of like a synchronistic feeling between mind and body. It was physical, kind of a physical thing,
Uh-huh. But things were
but not
feeling really coordinated or tuned or
really
something.
coordinated and just not self-conscious.
Ah,
You're not self-conscious about my movements. This was kind of like a skiing thing.
yeah.
That was the thing that came to mind. I
Right.
wish I could think of a lot more examples.
Well, you probably could tonight, if you want to continue with this exercise, it's probably pretty useful.
to try to think of more
Yeah.
times. You know,
Yeah.
And what about them, the quality of them?
Right.
Uh-huh.
I find that's typical. People don't usually think about their best experiences in life, but why not? You know,
Yeah, exactly.
we think about all kinds of other stuff that's not very useful. Bills we've got and terrible things we have to do. We obsess about those. You want to, what was yours?
Mine was also physical. It was related to mountain biking. And I think the words I associate would be a combination of excitement, but also surrendering to the physical forces acting on your body, on my body. And
okay, good. Okay, so here's kind of a summary of some research that I did in that project that I mentioned to you, trying to get all the definitions and descriptions of time, space, and knowledge from those 3 or 4 books at that time that were published. The center of this is what you could call the zone. And the periphery is meant to indicate 12 types of normal or typical experience that we have. So there's 12 dimensions here, split up into 12 parts. And the zones in the center, or the experience, the peak experiences, those qualities will be in the center here. And the normal ones that we have are on the periphery. So for example, we can take flow, that's the first one. Dimension of flow. So the normal experience on this dimension is that things take effort. Typically things take effort to do. That's the opposite of what you're describing, of surrendering to some experience and it just kind of goes by itself. And you feel pretty integrated or coordinated. So the flow experience corresponding to the effort would be unobstructed flow, no controlling. So I'm trying to use just a few words to describe the essence of that. So we have, on the one hand, the normal experiences, things take us effort to complete. We're used to this. And we like to control things, and we feel some resistance to doing almost anything. But why? How come? Why do we so often feel like we need effort to do things, physical or not? Mental things are the same. Unless you're really unusual, almost everybody agrees that almost everything takes some effort. Okay, we'll take another dimension here. Let's take another one almost the same is 11, the feeling of time. Okay, so the normal experience is that we are in time and it flows. It feels like it's separate from us, apart. It goes from past, present to future, and we don't seem to be able to stop it. On the other hand, in the zone, it feels like things are timeless. And we don't experience time around us or pushing us or pressuring us when we have deadlines or not. So there's this contrast, again, between the zone experience and the typical one we have in linear time. It's another word there, linear. most often time seems to flow in a linear way. And another way to describe that is it has an arrow. It's quite often depicted as having an arrow, the arrow of time. But does it really? In the zone, quite often people will describe experiences where there is no arrow. It's not like time is going anywhere. So there's quite a difference there. Okay, let's look at number 6, identity. Another really important one. On the periphery, it says existing self. So normally we feel like we have or we are, speaking of identity, an existing self or self-image, we might say, in terms that are used here in the Institute quite often. In the zone, it says ownerless happening. It's a little awkward to even try to describe it. But ownerless it means just that. It doesn't feel like we own what's happening. And happening is kind of like it's going by itself. So there's this contrast between our normal experience, so-called normal, where I'm here, I have my identity, which is present. It's not past or future, it's present all the time in this normal way of being. And I own my experience. Things are happening with me and inside me, and I feel like I own them, and I usually feel like I control them to some extent, but not always, and not completely. Okay, so we'll go to a different part of this. See how lucky I am. Whoa.
That was
What happened?
Be here now.
Yeah. I'm not used to this thing. But this is the one I want, so we'll see if this works. Oh, I almost did that wrong. I want this one. I think. Or did I go back to the same thing? Oh, I went back to the same one. All right, I'll try it again. So exciting. Sorry, Richard. Oh, okay. There. All right. So we're going to go through these 12 dimensions in a little more detail. And I'll have some quotes from the TSK books here that we can use to get an idea for the different levels, especially the first and third level. Normal experience and the zone. So the first dimension has this question that's associated with it. What happens to our personal will, to effort, and to control when our lives improve, when we move toward the zone? What happens to personal will, effort, and control? Okay, so the next bullet there, the second bullet, says normally, this is at first level, you might say, in TSK, or normally, our normal experience, things take effort, they take some discipline, some willpower and control. And we have some stress and we struggle against some kind of friction in the world. It just seems like there's friction built into the world. Why? Is that right? Does it seem like there's some kind of friction built into the world? Usually. And maybe even chaos. Okay, but the third bullet here is meant to indicate what happens when we get closer to the zone, when we're more involved, you might say also. Things are more spontaneous, more effortless. They seem to go more by themselves in some kind of frictionless flow. The word flow has been made pretty popular these days by a Hungarian psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a book called Flow. Action is powerful. Things are pretty well coordinated, synchronistic or serendipitous, you might say. Synchronous. I think he used a couple of those words. Okay. I want to go. Uh-oh. I'll try that one. Nope. Am I going to have to do this the hard way? All right. I have to do it the hard way. Oh, maybe here. Ah. I'll resume slideshow. No. Oh, good. Okay. Now this is a quote. This first bullet is a quote about the zone, or what you might call third level TSK. We live in a very fantastic, magical world. There is no doer or performer of the magic. So what's he saying here? If you're at the third level of experience, which you might call some level of enlightenment, it seems like nobody's doing anything. Nobody's running the show. There's no big doer that's obvious or even subtle. So the last bullet here is a question that we can use to clarify to some extent whether we're in the normal end of experience or in the zone end. Okay, so we can ask ourselves, are we using effort or control as a self, as a person, on something that feels kind of separate from us? This would be our normal experience. Or does whatever activity is happening seem to be going by itself somehow? Not that we understand it, but maybe it feels that way.
Like breathing.
Sorry?
Like breathing.
Like breathing. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip the paradoxes. Okay. Next dimension is creativity. Now the question here is, what seems to be the source or the cause of things that are happening? This is a question we don't ask very often, but it's pretty important. What's causing things to happen? In our normal experience, it seems like we are, to some extent. I'm doing things, I'm causing things to happen, or you are, or my friends are, or we're all doing something together, or so normally there's a strong sense of continuity from moment to moment. Things are sticking around, but they're changing gradually. And we have what we call causes and effects. People tend to be kind of habitual. So we're fixed to some extent, and to some extent we're changing. But reality also seems pretty stable. But when you move toward the zone, in high involvement in the zone, everyone and everything seems to be created mysteriously from moment to moment, except there aren't even moments anymore. So things are happening in a very creative way. Normally we think of creativity as something that is pretty limited. Like I'm fixed, but I'm creating something new here. But this is describing a general state of creativity from one worldview moment to another. So it's much bigger. Okay, here's a quote about the zone with our position not established in advance and our identity indeterminate. We have a different way of being. We can be what we're manifesting, what shows up in and through us as a kind of whole. So we're more a part of everything that's happening at once. The creativity is much larger. And we can ask this question to see which end of the spectrum we're on, either the normal or the zone end. Do things feel familiar, somewhat predictable, or even habitual, as they would normally? Or does each new moment, along with everything that appears in the scenario, seem spontaneous and fresh? If you've ever done acid or drugs, it's more like the second part. Things seem to be happening almost all by themselves. And it can be pretty broad, pretty widely based. And things can seem like they're totally out of control in the way we normally experience control. Okay. Let's take a look at the fourth dimension here. How did the experience of space, objects, boundaries, and the world change when we got closer to the zone? Or when we grow, when we transform, how did these things change? That's the question for this dimension. Normally, space is like a container. This room is like a big container, and we're in it. And you are like a container. You have a mind. And your mind is like a container. It has thoughts. You might say it has feelings. So it's like the spaces within spaces within spaces. And everything is divided. Space is extended also. Extends in all directions. So I think normally we think there's 3 dimensions. And that's what we seem to teach each other when we grow up in the West, to experience 3 dimensions that are extended. Okay, and it seems divisible, broken up into lots of different spaces and parts. and it separates things. So we have chairs and we have people in this room here. And the volume is limited, determinate. But when we go towards the zone, that all changes. It doesn't seem extended anymore. It seems like everything interpenetrates and is not separate from anything else. It all feels united, unified, intimate, you might even say. And it feels in a way like you can't go anywhere, but you don't need to. Because there doesn't seem to be anything that's divided from anything else. Very different. And things themselves are space directly. Not only are things not divided from each other, they are space. Oops. All right. Here's a quote about space and the zone. Space projects space into space. That's it. It's very simple, uncomplicated, and very peaceful. There are no fixed points. This is the feeling. There's no fixed points. And it seems like there's no fixed identity. But the quality of things remains. So the sense that you look like that remains. You still look like that, but you don't feel like you're separate anymore. So we all look different. We still look different, but we don't feel the same anymore. We don't feel like we're divided. No basis for war, arguing, anything like that. And we can ask this question to find out where we're located on a spectrum. Do objects and events take up space and appear to be separate and dispersed? That's the normal end. Or do they seem intimately connected in and even as one space? Like there's only really one space. Okay. Next one. Mental space. So the question in this dimension is, how does mind change as we grow, as we develop? Normally, it seems like there's a strong sense of separation between my mind and your mind, other people's minds. We can talk about reading other people's minds, but mostly that's an exception. It's pretty rare. And there's a sense of a self that is controlling or using my mind or your mind. So it feels like we have a mind, we own it, we control it to some extent, but with higher involvement in the zone, subject and object don't feel divided, nor do our minds. There's no sense of a locatable center that I have and operate from. And there's a merging with other people and other things. Okay, and then a quote for this dimension is, we're opening to the emergence of a knowing or an awareness which discerns that thoughts are going nowhere, getting nowhere, pointing nothing out. Meanings are different. When we want to indicate that there's some meaning, we need to point things out and talk about those things almost as if they're separate, or as if they're separate. Actually, we don't have to. The pointings can still carry some significance without having to separate things. So here's the question. Is there a private space or a personal world that feels separate from everything? That would be the normal way. Or do inner and outer, subjective and objective, appear to be inseparable facets of the same undivided space? That question might be helpful later on. Identity. All right, this is another really good dimension. Question here is, how does our identity change as we develop as individuals? Normally, there's a strong sense that we have an identity. In fact, that's who we are. That's the sense, the feeling. And it seems pretty continuous. If, as you were describing, you start losing your sense of identity just on the drop of a hat almost, it can be pretty upsetting. Not that it was, but it can be. Because we're used to this. We're used to this one kind of identity and it being continuous. But with a high sense of involvement, this starts to disappear more and more. And it seems that at times there's no owner to our experience. There may still be sensations and we may still apprehend the same world, same kind of worldview, but there may not feel like there's any owner to the experience anymore. And it may seem to go by itself. I think you were describing that too. Skiing or otherwise, we can have experiences of these experiences just happening by themselves with no effort, very spontaneous, but also very energetic and free. And in those experiences, quite often it feels like there's no separation between us and other. So the identity can come and go, and it does seem to do that as we grow as individuals. All right, so we've covered 6 of these 12 dimensions to some extent. But let me leave it open for a couple of questions now. We've got 5 minutes or so. Maybe you've got some questions or we want to discuss something. So let me leave that open. Yeah.
So these 6 were on the outside of the circle that you showed. I couldn't see what it said closer to the center of the circle, like what all those words said.
Oh yeah, they were pretty small.
Yeah, were they other things or were they like the part 2 of the?
That was meant to be the zone, the zone part of the dimensions, or the 3rd level, the more enlightened experience. So in the case of identity, oh good, we didn't do this one yet. It's a good example. Here it says, a new experiencer is called for. It's a funny word, experiencer. We don't usually use that one. But the identity changes when we're in the zone on this identity dimension. Instead of a self, which is what we're used to, you know, we talk about myself and yourself, but this says that we can change to a different type of being or identity, and you might call it more like light. I think that's what he says here, not the self or any agent of the self, but something attuned more directly to the energy of the present, more direct than the self. And he says, yes, a way presents itself. The experiencer can be transformed directly into light. Now, it might not happen right away, But that's what she was talking about also, what Linda was talking about. Awareness or light was there automatically. Wasn't something she had to conjure up or something that was a result of lots and lots of meditation necessarily. It's just there. Evidently, at a really fundamental level, that's who we are. We're awareness. And you can take away all the other stuff, you can die, and that'll still be there. So this is pretty fascinating stuff. And it's useful to know this. We will probably die, just about everybody does, from what I've heard. So, something we can actually prepare for. And that's common to the Tibetan tradition also. And in TSK, the exercises seem to elicit bringing more of this kind of identity out, bringing us more into a sense of being pure awareness rather than the self that will be dropped off when we die, from what the reports indicate. We can't take it with us, and we can't take the self with us either. But evidently, whether we faint, go to sleep, or die, the awareness remains.
And continues.
And continues and
Comes
continues.
in again.
Yeah, and some people would say that's the basis of our rebirth also.
That's what I was.
Yeah, it makes some sense. If that's the thing that remains after everything else has dropped off, what could be the basis of rebirth except this? I'll leave it up to you for future research. Yes.
I have a question. You started this off referencing athletes, and now athletes come to have their peak experiences in the zone. Do they also, would you say, identify all across all these 12 categories? And then what is it that they do happens to them that takes them into these experiences that's different from meditation or medical conditions?
Well, yeah, it is different. You know, they're not sitting when they play basketball. They would get criticized if they did that. So they're running around, they're doing all kinds of stuff, but they still somehow slip into these experiences. Like Michael Jordan made some pretty radical statements about playing basketball, and he almost couldn't miss. You know, he would say that. And also when he was, the teamwork that was going on when they were playing their best ball was astounding and appreciative, as those two were describing back there. Just something you could participate in and enjoy. And it seemed like it was happening kind of naturally in a way, but it wasn't directed by anybody, by the self, by anybody in the body of Michael Jordan or anybody else. Now, I forget the first part of what you were asking. I wanted to remember it. A lot of the research I did to write one of my papers on the zone was from a book called In the Zone. And that was almost totally about athletics and similar things like, well, non-athletic skiing, or there was a statement in the book about Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic and the experience he had of just all of a sudden feeling like he was completely spacious, not normal at all. And he said it was uncanny that he felt like he was walking on the clouds that he was flying through. But that was the experience, the one of space that we talked about a little bit there. And that's all he was space. Yeah.
consciousness, which is mentioned there.
Yeah.
And awareness, which you've mentioned. What would you say the relationship to those two is, and how does that relate to light itself?
Good. Okay. Luckily, I have a slide which gets right into that. Now, if you put up with me while I try to find it, let's see if I can do it. I've got to go back to the other presentation, because in gesture of balance, you know what, maybe I should just talk about it. In gesture of balance, he describes it. There's a really incredible chapter. I can't remember the name of the chapter. But in there, he describes that when we're born, around that time, or when we conceived, we're pure awareness. And after that, as we grow, as infants, evidently, he doesn't say as infants, but that's the idea, that as we grow thereabouts, our senses begin to function and get connected. And then we start to accumulate experiences and patterns. And this is part of our normal growth as a human. So we develop these ways of sensing the world. Unfortunately, for most of us, evidently, it accumulates karma. And he says, in a way, it's like dust. And I think he's describing it from his experience as a really enlightened being, that the way he sees it, it really is like dust. And it's karmic, and it's accumulation. The way we normally think about it in our culture is that it's a way to get along. And we need to do this. We need to learn how to be in the world and how to sense things and how to interpret, how to think, but it evidently accumulates karma. And then at some point, he says, if we could see through and use insight and awareness to get rid of these karmic patterns, we would see that we could clean it all out. And we'd be back to the awareness again. And it would be like dust, but it would be gone. It would be cleaned out.
But in reincarnation that you referred to, we come in with.
Yeah.
For whatever pattern we still have from before.
Yeah, to some degree. I don't know.
Yeah.
Degree,
I see it. He also talks about a lot about just repetition compulsion. It's like awareness knows, and then somehow we keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Instead of like, okay, it's like, got it. And then next, that's really it's that sticking on to something and repeating it. It's the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Not that.
But I think the important thing is that at bottom, we are awareness, and we don't need to keep accumulating these patterns and this kind of dust. If we can learn how to get rid of that dust, everything will be clean, everything will be beautiful, and someday.
You just won't get stuck.
And we won't be stuck. Yeah. And then we can't get, evidently, if you can keep at it, at some point it's irreversible too. And
What is irreversible?
this cleaning,
Or opening.
the cleaning and opening that we've done, and the lightening enlightening process. At some point, it's evidently irreversible, and we don't have to worry about or be afraid of going back into this kind of accumulation anymore.
Or you just recognize it, repeating.
Or maybe it never happens again.
If it does, it's not a big deal.
Yes.
I mean, in this, you know.
Yeah.
And what was sort of the methodology for this cleaning or dispelling karma?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too.
I'm sure it's a big one.
Okay, well, let me try to indicate what Krishnamurti says about that. There's a guy named Jiddu Krishnamurti, and I think he met Rinpoche in India, and they seemed to live in Varanasi together during the same period when Rinpoche was teaching in Varanasi. He was invited to teach there by the Dalai Lama. I forget what year that was, but that did happen. He was there, and so Krishnamurti, I read something he wrote on, the book is called The Future of Humanity by Krishnamurti and David Bohm. So they took up this question that you asked, like, how do you get rid of this karma? How do you get rid of this dust? And one interesting thing he said, which was very striking, was thought cannot do it. It's incapable. Thought can't get rid of thought, and like dust. Dust like thought. But if you have insight, that's the word he used. And I think he meant awareness, pure awareness. Pure awareness can do it, and that belongs to the mind. If the brain is relaxed enough and there's pure insight or awareness, it can affect a cleaning of the brain. And evidently Krishnamurti was going through that. He described it in one of his books called A Journal. He had a constant headache. And it seemed that was part of the process of cleaning the brain. So awareness seems capable, but the kind of process that we go through normally with a therapist, a psychotherapist, won't do it.
Well, that's what it is.
Unless it's the awareness that's doing it as part of that.
And the thing is that to me, it's not like bad karma. It's like ahas.
Yeah.
Like you understand where you got caught and why. And it's like, well, no wonder.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just all is wisdom,
Right.
understanding.
Like flash of insight.
Insight and like.
But it's not thinking that does it.
No.
Sorry.
I had seen Krishnamurti speak a fair number of times, and one of his books that I had was, I think the book was called Thought Breeds Fear.
Mm-hmm.
A what?
Thought Breeds Fear.
Ah.
And I think also he was very actually agitated from time to time. And when I saw him about the future, he wasn't optimistic about it.
No.
Yeah.
No, he wasn't. In fact, he's, yeah. Yeah, a statement he made was, becoming is the very source of the destructive current that's putting the future of humanity at risk. So trying to change as people use it by means of the future and time, which TSK works with directly, is putting the future of humanity at risk. And I think you can almost see that now. There's a lot of stuff that could really blow everything up that's going on right now. And it's because people are trying to change things without knowing how to do it, with insight and with awareness. They're basing their efforts to change on ego and self. And I think it's happening pretty strongly in politics right now. It's one example. And countries are at stake. Okay, well, we're well over time, but I really enjoyed this myself, and I hope you got something out of it. Enjoyed it yourself too. Yes.
Are these texts available to the public or for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody who wants the PowerPoint or the articles I mentioned that I wrote or references, send me an email.
And then TKS.
TSK.
TSK.